Of course, I want to welcome a very special guest who I had the pleasure of meeting during my guest host stint on the Jimmy Dore Show. She is a civil rights litigator and a host of the Previously Prohibited podcast. Welcome to the program, Jenin Younes. Jenin, great to see you again. Thanks so much for joining.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Of course. Great to see you. So,
Yeah.
I remember last time we were talking about the ICE murders in Minneapolis, and more bad news to talk about today. So thanks
That's
for
what I'm here for.
that's what you're here for. Exactly. So, for those who are not familiar with your work, on your Twitter bio here, it says you were canceled by the left for your COVID views and the right for your Palestine views. So, do you want to just explain, for those who don't know, your history of advocacy and how it got you in trouble with people on all across the political spectrum, as they say?
Yeah, sure. So I was a public defender in New York when COVID happened in 2020, and which is a very left-wing profession for those who aren't aware,
Yes.
especially in New York City. And I would have considered myself on the left, although I always had some, I had a strong libertarian streak always, and the left had been becoming increasingly authoritarian, in my view, when it came to free speech, and I was sort of arguing with people about that on and off. And then when COVID happened, I was pretty staunch in my views that it was both civil liberties violative and probably a very bad idea to disrupt society in the way that we were doing, to do lockdowns and that kind of thing, and then mandates. And I encountered opposition, to say the least. People were not very welcoming of my views, and I was sort of surprised by the degree to which people were unwilling to discuss it, I have to say. Like, I knew that I would face opposition because my views weren't mainstream, but I thought that maybe, like, this is a new thing, people will be willing to talk about it. And they were very dismissive and immediately said, like, what, are you like a right winger now? Do you like Trump? Like, no, I just like think
Right.
these are bad ideas. So I ended up sort of joining a I ended up joining a libertarian law firm in DC, moving to DC. And I would say, like, no longer identifying as a leftist, really, but more of a libertarian, and doing a lot of litigation to challenge COVID mandates and censorship around the COVID issue. And then after October 7th, I once again found myself sort of homeless because the people around me were, I don't want to say everybody, but a lot of the people were on the censorship side and sort of saying, this is anti-Semitic, that's anti-Semitic, so it's okay to deport people for saying this, it's okay to kick them off campus for doing this. And I was like, no, that's also free speech that we,
Right.
I thought we agreed was
Right.
protected. So just sort of a more or less half a decade of finding myself politically homeless.
Well, yeah, it says on the background banner, this free speech defender makes enemies left and right. First Amendment lawyer Jenin Younes. I don't know what exactly it says there, but it says basically you sued Biden over his censorship policies, but now you say Trump is worse. And I remember when I talked to you on the Jimmy Dore Show, one of the key moments in coming around to the opinion that Trump was actually worse on the issue of free speech than Biden had to do with the case of Mahmoud Khalil. We did get some bad news on this front this week. Immigration Board denies Mahmoud Khalil's appeal, bringing activists one step closer to deportation. So I'll just read a few brief paragraphs from here. The United States Board of Immigration Appeals rejected Mahmoud Khalil's request to throw out his deportation case on Friday. The Trump administration has been attempting to deport high-profile pro-Palestinian activist Mahmoud Khalil since 2025, arguing his activism could harm U.S. foreign policy. Khalil said he was not surprised by the ruling, which he called biased and politically motivated. His attorneys said he cannot be lawfully detained or deported as he pursues a separate case in the federal court system. The Board of Immigration Appeals sets precedent in the Byzantine immigration court system, which is controlled by the DOJ and increasingly under the influence of the Trump administration. Khalil suffered a significant setback in his federal case earlier this year, with a U.S. appeals panel ruling the judge in New Jersey overstepped his authority by releasing him. In a 2-1 decision, the panel found that law requires the case to fully move through the immigration courts before Khalil can challenge the decision in federal court. Khalil's lawyers are requesting the full appeals panel reconsider the decision. Earlier this month, they asked one of the appellate panel's judges to step aside because of his previous role as a top Justice Department official involved in investigating student protesters. Khalil was born in Syria to a Palestinian family and holds Algerian citizenship through a distant relative. He has said that he could be targeted and even killed if he is deported. And like I said, this case was something that you have commented on a lot in the past. You just um, announced that you will be posting regularly to your Substack legal commentary going forward. My first piece addresses the administration's latest renewed efforts to deport people for expression of political views. The title here: the Trump administration renews its campaign to flout non-citizens' First Amendment rights. So let's start as broad as we can with this question, because there's going to be some, and I'm sure you've run into people on Twitter and elsewhere who read this headline here and say, well, non-citizens don't have First Amendment rights because they're non-citizens. So can you explain why that's actually wrong?
Yes. So the First Amendment is a restraint on government. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. That
Right.
applies to the executive as well. The courts have been very clear about that. The reason that the framers didn't say the executive is that they didn't anticipate the executive to be making law as it effectively does these days. So it's a restraint on government and it has nothing to do with the citizenship status of the speaker. And also, when you look at the justifications for the First Amendment, we don't want government to be deciding what political views are valid, what should be heard, what should be silenced. The idea behind it is that more debate is good, especially when it comes to politics. And I would argue, I don't know that the framers ever said anything like this. They may have, but I would argue that actually we should want to hear from people like Mahmoud Khalil, who comes from an refugee, was born in a refugee camp, I believe. That helps us better to understand foreign policy. And the idea that we should just deport people because they say things that are uncomfortable to our ears is antithetical to the principles underlying the First Amendment. So there, in my opinion, doctrinally, principally, and legally, it's just totally off base. And the Supreme Court has actually said that non-citizens have First Amendment rights. They said that during the Red Scare era. And there were a couple of cases that I sort of skirted the line, and I would say generally I disagree with the Supreme Court's reasoning, but I think they can also be cabined. They basically said that it was okay to deport non-citizens for membership in the Communist Party, but that was a time when it was okay to punish citizens for membership in the Communist Party. So was sort of like, well, you can punish this person, that this is the form of punishment that can take place because they're not a citizen. We recognize now that you couldn't punish a citizen for expressing the same views, or at least you shouldn't be able to. I guess maybe that is happening, but so you shouldn't be able to deport someone for those views either.
Yeah. So to me, it's like so the justification that his speech can harm foreign policy objectives, and I know this is kind of written down in the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1952, but this seems philosophically very inconsistent with the First Amendment because A, how does one's speech harm a country's foreign policy interests? And assuming it could, it must also be possible for a citizen's speech to harm a foreign policy interest. Like, what's the difference? If you're saying speech can harm our foreign policy, then it doesn't matter if the person's a citizen or not. So then you have to ask, okay, well, what is the penalty for a citizen whose speech harms the foreign policy interest in the country? There seems to be none on the books that are applied specifically in this way, at least at the moment. So it seems to be like, either the government is saying non-citizens' opinions have more impact than those of citizens, which doesn't really make sense, or that citizens have more leeway to criticize the government than non-citizens, which again is antithetical to the First Amendment because of what you just said. The First Amendment is not the government granting freedom of speech to people. The First Amendment is a limitation on the government. It's a command that the government not interfere with every person's God-given right to free speech. So how do those things square?
Well, they don't. And that's why courts, for the most part, have read the foreign policy exception that you cited to encapsulate not speech.
Right.
There's one court, to my knowledge, has said to the extent it does appear to encompass speech, then it's not constitutional. So either it's not constitutional if Congress intended it to encompass speech, or Congress didn't intend for it to include speech. I would say the probably easier thing for lawyers to argue, because courts don't like to strike down statutes, it's just to argue that Congress didn't intend to include speech in that. And the fact that it's been in effect since the 50s and is very rarely invoked and has not really been used to encompass pure political speech. I mean, what Mahmoud Khalil did is pretty, run of the, like, he was a pro-Palestine human rights advocate. He didn't even advocate for violent resistance, although I would argue that you have the First Amendment right to do that, whether you're a citizen or not. He's repeatedly condemned anti-Semitism, never said anything anti-Semitic. So it's just total nonsense. It's a way of trying to get rid of someone who I think is actually quite an effective leader. That's probably why they targeted him. And you referred earlier to the BIA's, the Bureau of Immigration Appeals decision. I wasn't expecting anything different, to be honest. The immigration courts are really stacked at this point. And there was actually an article I read either today or yesterday about how Trump has fired a number of immigration judges who have found against him on these issues. Right. So this shows why Mahmoud Khalil's, we can get into the weeds if you want, of what the Third Circuit's decision was, but why that decision was so wrong-headed, because it effectively denies people recourse to the federal courts until they've exhausted their immigration appeals, which can be years. As we're seeing in this case, it looks like it's about a year or a little bit more. So these courts are not fair. They're part of DOJ. They're part of the executive. Your boss is the prosecutor. So, like, the incentives are not to be fair.
Well, it's just so crazy. I mean, even this conversation that we're having is something that is so obviously beyond the curiosities of a guy like Donald Trump. And I think part of why Donald Trump appeals to so many people, or at least did appeal at one time to so many people, not according to the numbers right now, is that, he has this very like lizard-brained yes or no approach to things, right? I mean, the question that he asked himself and that he asked the voters is, should immigrants be allowed to come in here and trash America? And there are a lot of people who just say, well, no. Yeah. And there's such danger in setting policy that way or enforcing law in that way. And this is the thing that drives me crazy. And I'm going to toss to you in a second, because I would think, as someone who spent so much time sort of engaging with right-wingers who oppose the COVID tyranny, like, don't you understand how the government's saying, well, we can deny this group their speech rights? Don't you see how it's like the exact same thing as like 2 weeks to flatten the curve? Like, yes, it's the exact same thing. Because I'm sure 2 weeks to flatten the curve, I mean, it made sense to a lot of people at the time. Hey, there's this virus. We don't know anything about it. We don't want to die. We don't want to give up our rights, but we also don't want to die. So, hey, maybe 2 weeks to flatten the curve. In this case, why not, right? But why not is because once you flip that switch, once you give the government that kind of power to just arbitrarily decide, okay, who has rights and when and for what, at that point, you're giving them the power to do whatever they want to whoever they want.
Yeah, exactly. I was just talking to people about this, conservatives about this, who are actually very wise conservatives. They actually were on my side with it. But the justification behind this was basically, our policy is anti-Semitism around the world, our foreign policy. And Mahmoud Khalil, by being pro-Palestinian human rights, is anti-Semitic. I mean, that's a logical flaw there, but set that aside. So conservatives should realize there might be a President Newsom or whoever, AOC or whatever, in a few years, and they could say, it's our foreign policy to be pro-trans rights around the world. And non-citizens who say, I don't think children should undergo sex change surgery, should be deported, because that's antithetical to our foreign policy views about the rights of trans people around the world. This exact same logic can be imported to that situation. And then, are you going to be a fan of that policy? I don't think so.
Right. No, this is the wokest shit. Like, they turned out to be the wokest snowflakes of them all. It's just it's really unbelievable. It's unbelievable to see. But while we're on the topic of Mahmoud Khalil, just to back things up a little bit, you talked about getting in the weeds of this. Do you want to just talk a little bit about what you think is going to happen in his case, since it obviously does not look good at this point?
Well, there's his immigration case and there's his federal case, and those are two separate things. So he filed a petition in federal court basically saying so anybody in the United States has the right to file what's called the habeas petition, basically saying that their detention violates the federal constitution. So he did that, and ultimately that case wound up in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And the Third Circuit said they didn't say he doesn't have First Amendment rights, but they said we don't have jurisdiction. He has to exhaust his immigration appeals before the federal courts can hear the case. That's a big problem because it can take months or years to go through, as I mentioned, through the immigration system. So I actually wrote an amicus brief, like a friend of the court brief, that was signed onto by a number of free speech organizations like FIRE and can't off the top of my head, not some left, some right, but basically saying this is antithetical to the First Amendment. The idea that somebody could be detained for months or years while their speech is being chilled, and also sending a chilling effect to other non-citizens, is not what the framers had in mind, and you should have recourse to the federal courts before that. So we're hoping that the entire Third Circuit Court of Appeals rehears the case. This was a 3-judge panel. What happens when you go to a federal court of appeal is that your case gets assigned to a random 3-judge panel. Well, it's theoretically random. There are a lot of rumors that it's not as random as we're supposed to believe, but let's set that one aside. So it gets assigned to a 3-judge panel, but there are about 30 judges or so, depending on the circuit, in this circuit. So you can, if you think the decision is really bad, you can ask for all of the judges of the circuit to rehear the case. And that's what we're doing. We're saying, well, I'm not representing him, but he is saying that, and then we're backing him up as like free speech organizations, basically saying this is really important. You guys all need to hear this case and vacate the really bad decision the 3-judge panel issued. It was 2 out of 3 judges issued that decision. So there was a dissenter.
Got it. Got it. Okay, so before we move on to our next topic, I didn't want to brush past this too much. You are starting, I guess, last week, posting weekly on your Substack about the free speech offenses of the Trump administration. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about this project and where people can find it? Did you just start this Substack, or are you kind of repurposing it?
So I actually opened one a year ago and never did anything with it.
Got it. Yeah.
But I decided to try to start posting weekly commentary. I wouldn't say just restricted to the Trump administration, but to First Amendment issues sort of writ large in our country. So I'll just be doing weekly commentary, if not more. I have another one ready to go tomorrow, so I'll be posting it.
Okay, awesome. And where can people find that?
I think it's just my name on Substack.
Oh, JeninYounes.substack.com. There you go.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Please clap.